Hello everyone, I'm here with a different type of video today. I'm going to be talking about television. Never thought I'd see the day. Actually, it's been a long time coming. But no, I'm going to be talking about a streaming TV show on Netflix called The Crown. You may have heard of it. I'm assuming if you come upon this video, you're a major Crown fan like I am. And of course, The Crown is unfortunately now over for now because the sixth and final season just premiered, wrapping up the entire series this past December. And now that I've had some time to digest the final season and go back and revisit some of the earlier ones, I feel I want to make a video talking about my most favorite and least favorite episodes of the show. There are 60 episodes, each running close to an hour, 50 minutes to an hour. So, it's a pretty impressive body of work that the creator, Peter Morgan, has given to us and, of course, to Netflix. I think this is Netflix's most prestigious show. One of their best critically acclaimed, one of their most consistently, award receiving programs that has come out of that streaming service. This show is almost too good for Netflix. I've always felt that way. But I watched The Crown right when it premiered, not long after the first couple episodes, the first season dropped, all the way back in November of 2016. I watched with my family because my parents and I are both Anglophiles. We love history. My parents have gotten me more into history. And I gotta be honest, Peter Morgan, through this show, has gotten me more into history, though particularly 20th century British history. But history in general, it's actually gotten me further into European history, royal history, all these kind of World War I and World War II, all of these things that the Crown opened up for me. It's kind of interesting, and American history never interested me that much in school. And to this day, I'm not as interested in American history. Obviously, there isn't as long of a history, at least not in the way that it's documented in other parts of the world. And European history is just so complex. But if we look at the UK, which The Crown is, for those who are not familiar, though I'm sure you all are if you're watching this video, The Crown is about the British royal family. It's about the monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, though it's not entirely about her, especially as the seasons progress through Elizabeth's reign. It starts to be more about her children and the state of the United Kingdom sociopolitically at the time of the years that she ruled. But The Crown is, for all intents and purposes, it's about Queen Elizabeth II, who passed away just last year at the age of 96. The show starts with her marriage to the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, in 1947, and goes all the way to 2005 with a scene that foreshadows her own funeral, which would happen a little under 20 years later. Peter Morgan is very careful not to let the show stray. He always feels with all of his projects to never want to stray within 15 to 20 years of the present day, as he feels that it starts to become more journalistic rather than a prestigious sort of perspective piece on history. And I think that's a smart move. It absolves you of potentially getting into hot water with people who are very much living with the current dramas of today. Even though we found that even with seasons 5 and 6, some of this drama content only being 30 or 40 years old is not long enough ago for people to really forgive Peter Morgan for chronicling it in such a way, in such a dramatized fashion. There is so much preamble and prelude I could talk about. The show has come under fire, particularly with recent seasons, about accuracy, historical accuracy, dramatizations of private people's lives that very much are very connected to the people that are alive today. With the exception of Diana and, of course, now the Queen Elizabeth, but that was when the show was predominantly airing. She was still alive. These people could watch the show and had lived effects of how it would portray them. If you talk about Winston Churchill today, no one really cares if the portrayal is that accurate because Winston's long dead. But it's different with people who are very much in the public eye today, or are young enough or are very alive to live with the repercussions of consciousness of them being formed by a dramatization. But I always stood by the fact that the royal family, the price they pay for being who they are, is that they are always public figures, whether they want to be or not. and especially the ones closest to the inner circle of the monarchy. And dramatization of their lives is nothing new in Hollywood and is something that will continue to happen, whether they like it or not. And for them to put a foot down and say they do not like this, I think is bringing into questions that they don't want asked about their standing in society, their privilege in society. It's the price that they pay. I don't feel too bad. I mean, especially since Peter Morgan does a phenomenal job with representing the nuance of all of these characters. I don't think he does a hatch job completely on any of them, at least not, with a direct kind of malicious intent that you can tell is directly coming from the writers. I think that perhaps some characters could have been better fleshed out. He definitely rushes through a lot of history very quickly because, he's covering 60 years roughly in 60 episodes. And tons of stuff is going to be left out. A lot of things are going to have to be truncated, abbreviated, mixed around. Obviously, we've got a lot of private conversation, the bulk of the show being private conversation, that we are not privy to, that a dramatization fills in the blanks for. And people getting up in arms about potentially some things that have been said, not, potentially towing the line of a certain narrative that the royal family may not want out there. It's a bit overblown due to the fact that we know that this is a dramatization. Anyone who is watching The Crown and looking at these behind closed doors conversations and thinking that Peter Morgan somehow has a transcript that he is copying for almost all of these. We do have some letters that are kind of private that have started to come out now, especially for the early royal history of the 20th century. But modern stuff, 100% private, it's conjecture. And I think very artful and appreciative conjecture. I would say, I'm going to say appreciated because this is a video about the crown and royal pronunciation, the Queen's English, so to speak. And so I hate seeing the whole hubbubaloo, and it's died down quite a bit. When season 5 premiered last year, in 2022, there was a lot more of an uproar, and I think that certain things were taken out of context. I'll talk about that in a couple episodes because it comes up with one or two that I want to discuss. I could talk about The Crown all day. So this video, although it will be lengthy, I'm trying not to completely go over the moon here. But, with all that being said, I'm not saying that there might be a few things that Peter Morgan could have done differently to perhaps be more fair to certain characters. I understand the constraints he's in, again, with a TV show and limited time to tell us a story. You do need to craft a compelling narrative at the end of the day. This is, a docudrama, but the drama is sort of more important than the documentarian part of it. Even though I'm very interested in biopics. I know a lot of people, I think, in film spaces are kind of burnt out by biopics. There are a lot of biopics that aren't necessarily bad in Hollywood, but they aren't necessarily phenomenal either. They can often feel a little disingenuous to the actual person they're centered around, like other agendas are intruding upon the actual story or overall presence of the character that the biopic is supposed to be about. Or they can be a snooze fest. I mean, that's what a lot of people, I don't find them, especially if they're about interesting figures in history, I don't find them to be quite as dull as others do, because I think a lot of people like shock and kind of crazy storytelling. But real life is kind of, it's different from how you'd write a traditional script. And I think that some biopics can be really a good way of depicting that. But obviously Peter Morgan has to come up with these narratives, these arcs and stories within the show that are, loosely, as best as possible, based on the actual lived history of these individuals. But they have to turn into characters in sort of like a soap opera. And so you can't insult the intelligence of the average viewer by saying it needs a disclaimer to remind you that this is what's going on. I just think that, as many of the actors of The Crown have said in defense of the show, it's insulting to the audience and it's insulting to the show. I mean, obviously as well, because this is a show that does such a wonderful job, I think, with handling all of the crazy stories that the royal family has. And, I would really love to see other kinds of royal families depicted in the Peter Morgan style. I want to see one of the Japanese monarchy of the 20th century. I think that could be really interesting. There aren't as many monarchies as there used to be, and the 20th century, a lot of them fell, at the beginning of it. So the British monarchy standing today is testament to the way Queen Elizabeth decided to run things. And it's now very interesting that King Charles is on the throne, and the show talks about this a little bit in the final season, in the final episode, which I'll talk about, where the direction of the monarchy is going to actually go. For some context, I am part British. My dad is from the UK. My mom is American. So I've been to the UK loads of times. And so the royal family is something I have a little bit more than the average American exposure to. We would watch the Queen's speech on Christmas. That was something that most of my American friends were like, what? But, it was definitely not something I was as interested in until The Crown. The Crown really got me interested in the royal family. It's actually very interesting also that The Crown came out right around the time that Harry and Meghan went public with their relationship in the fall of 2016, which was another major event for the royal family that caused a lot of hyper-focus and scrutiny, not unlike the situation with Diana in the 80s and 90s. So, the history does repeat itself, and we'll talk about that in this video. Again, so much to unpack, and I don't want this preamble to be too long. This, at the end of the day, is a ranking video. That's what I like to do on this channel these days, even though I usually talk about music. The music is good on this show, too, and I will talk about that. But I'll get to it. I'm going to try and cover everything as I go through the episodes that I want to talk about, and then at the end, I will kind of do a catch-all of any other thoughts that I might have on the show, but also on the royal family and the current situation they find themselves in, a la Harry and Meghan, and just a ton of things, King Charles now being on the throne. There's a lot to unpack. Prince Andrew. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, but I will. I could make a whole separate video about my thoughts on all of this. I did read Harry's memoir last year, so I have to bring it up. I thought, I'm going to talk about The Crown, and then eventually I will talk about Harry's memoir. Because if The Crown, hadn't come out, I don't know if I would have been as interested in reading Harry's memoir. But watching The Crown and then reading that, it's the only royal biography I've ever read. Or only book about the royal family I've ever read. Pardon me. I've read a lot of, articles. I've never read a book. And so it's a really interesting peer behind the curtain, which Harry has, said in public. The show does a wonderful job of it. But like with any show, as much as I love it, there are highs and there are lows. But I do want to make it very clear that the lows of this season, in terms of my least favorite episodes, are still very very much top tier television filmmaking, I would argue, compared to especially what you see on Netflix, but in general. So, I take that into consideration when I tell you my 5 least favorite episodes of The Crown. I'm going to start with the least favorite, and then I'll go into my 15 favorite, and these are going to be ranked in order. I'm not going to talk about every single episode because, like I said, there's 60 of them, so the rest of them are kind of in the middle. I will give some honorable mention shout-outs, so I guess I'll technically talk about my top 20. But I decided to just focus on 5 at the bottom instead of more than that because I don't want to dwell too much on the negative. But I have to address some episodes that don't live up to the standards of previous seasons. Although it's pretty hard for me to rank these bottom 5. I think it was pretty easy for me to see about what the bottom 5 or 6 episodes were, but putting them in some kind of order was a little bit more tricky. I think I will start with the very bottom, and then I can work my way up. But like I said, I'll skip a giant chunk to get to the top 15. So what is the worst episode of this show? Well, you could certainly look at IMDb, and that did come into consideration. I did look at the average user scores on there. But okay, so ultimately, I decided to put at the very bottom the season premiere episode of season 5, Queen Victoria's Syndrome. The reason why I placed this episode at the very bottom is because I think that introducing us to new characters, the show, cycles through actors every 2 seasons, and now we have the 1990s, and we are having aged up characters here. This episode is in 1991, and it's centered around Charles and Diana going on a second honeymoon It's basically a one last gasp kind of promo tour for their relationship. Well, for their intimate kind of personal side of their relationship, not so much their professional side, which is a big critique I have of Peter Morgan because I actually don't think that the second honeymoon was as interesting of a story to focus on for an episode like this than their 1992 tour of the world where they go to Asia. In 1992, they go to India, and there's that iconic photo of Princess Diana sitting by herself in front of the Taj Mahal. And it's sort of foreboding because it's showing that the relationship is really not going well. For the first time so vividly in photos, you can get a sense for people at the time. And then there was also a really tense trip to South Korea where apparently Charles and Diana, it was just palpable how uncomfortable they were with each other. And so I think it would have been far more interesting and a more, great way to see other locations for Peter Morgan to center the opening of season 2 around that world tour rather than this yacht outing that he's on with Diana and a bunch of their friends. And the boys. I mean, it's foreshadowing to when she spends a lot of time on yachts in season 6 with Dodi Fayed, but it's almost like by that point we've already seen the yacht thing, and that's more important for that part of the story. I feel like The Crown does a lot better when it's a little bit more elevated than just showing rich people on yachts. But I guess part of the reason why he wanted to show that boat was because it was also showing the Royal Britannia, which is the royal yacht, which Queen Elizabeth famously had to retire in 1997 because the cost of repairs was going to be too much for the taxpayer. She confronts the relatively newly elected Prime Minister John Major in this episode about the propositions, and he says, even for the Conservative Party, who's very monarchist, this is a tall expense. We're not sure if we can get you these repairs. And so the episode is sort of meant to be a parable on the Queen aging and her realizing that the Royal Britannia needs a lot of repairs. Philip and her have a little dynamic about it. It's all in all not really an eventful episode. There's not a lot that happens beyond setting the tone of the rest of the season, introducing every character so that you get an idea of like, oh, that's how Anne looks now. But she gets a stupid little line when she's spying, her future husband from a lighthouse. It's not. It's a little too subtle, or it's just emphasizing how the show isn't focused on things that are as interesting anymore. I just feel like this episode I want so much more from it. And then on top of that, you have the kind of treading on thin water episode that even got John Major to speak out about the show, saying, Charles never approached me about, asking for him to step in and have the monarchy, favor Charles and ask Elizabeth to step down. This was sort of blown out of the water before the episode aired. And when you actually watch the episode, you can see that that's not so much what went down. It was very much Charles ruminating on the possibility, and John Major doesn't really respond to it. He's like, what are you asking me to do? Like, that's not something you should be talking to me about. And I'm certainly not going to entertain this idea. I think that John Major is portrayed very accurately in this scenario. Whereas I feel like we get to see, Dominic West's Charles kind of show himself to be this, great modernist reformer of the monarchy, which is a theme throughout all 20 episodes of his version of Charles that we see. And I just overall, there's also like the trope of them being afraid of the newspapers coming in, and Queen Victoria syndrome is about Queen Victoria staying on the throne too long. Elizabeth is wondering if maybe, the papers have a point. They've tread this sort of territory of like fearing what the press might think of the monarchy way more interestingly in the past of the season and in future episodes. So when you look back at this episode, it sort of stands out as like a half-hearted attempt at better story points that are more riveting to watch. You don't really feel any of the drama, and it just doesn't really feel like the episode's moving anywhere. It's just introducing the new actors and setting the tone of the season. And like I said, a real missed opportunity to not include that, pretty world-renowned press tour in 1992, which was only a year after where this episode was set. I just think I would have done very differently how I opened season 5. So coming in as the next to worst episode, I have to go with episode 2 of season 5. So season 5 really got off to a rough start. And you're going to so notice a lot of episodes in this list are about season 5. Spoiler alert. Yeah, so unfortunately, season 5 is the worst season of the show. I think most Crown fans agree. Now that we've seen season 6, we can all say, okay, season 6 is slightly more return to form. But there was a serious dip in quality from season 4 to season 5, especially if you look back at seasons 1 and 2. And that's very apparent here. And what do I have a problem with season 5, episode 2, called The System? Again, the storyline is not very interesting, and it's told in a very kind of lackadaisical, kind of light on its feet manner. We're supposed to care a lot about Philip having this potential romance or affair with a woman who's very close to the family. And it would cause a big, brouhaha if this got out. And of course, again, it caused a little bit of uproar because people say that this is making up a fictitious affair that Philip may or may not had. I'm not interested in having that conversation, but I just don't think that the episode, although it has some charming scenes, very charming scenes of Philip riding a carriage horse, when you think about the subject matter that the Crown could be covering, especially in the 90s, this is not an interesting storyline. I mean, I do think that Jonathan Pryce is a phenomenal actor, and I do think he does a phenomenal job as Philip. But the episodes that are centered solely around Philip, even this was a problem with Tobias Menzies as well, are not as strong because they feel like very much a deviation from more interesting storylines that are going on. They feel like we're trying to humanize this character who's always just sort of been in the background, especially past season 2. I hate saying that about Philip, but this is Queen Elizabeth's show, okay? And Margaret's. We don't care as much about Philip. He's just a nice, dodgy old man, okay? Let him have his carriage riding, and of course, yeah, his eye's going to look the other way sometimes. He does have some great lines. I do think that the episode has moments, the other part of the story is Diana talking about covertly leaking information for a tell-all book written by this author. Which is, of course, going to get Charles very annoyed. And again, I feel like Diana, this is a trend we're going to see in the episodes I don't like of season 5. We're seeing Diana as very kind of withdrawn. She's very much locked up in Kensington Palace. She's not out and about amongst the people like you would imagine her to be in the 90s at the height of her fame. We see Diana just being very reticent and kind of a little bit airy and wafy, which I think is somewhat her persona. And again, I want to make one thing very clear. Debicki is not at fault here. It's the writing. I think that Elizabeth Debicki is probably the best portrayal I've seen ever of Diana. And I'm not someone who necessarily really was that familiar with her. I mean, she passed away when I was 4 years old. I've only seen adaptions of her, Emma Corrin did a phenomenal job as well. There was Kristen Stewart recently in the movie Spencer. And I know Naomi Watts was in a movie called Diana not that long ago. I mean, she's been really, gotten the Marilyn Monroe biopic treatment. Understandably, she's a very fascinating figure with a very tragic story, similar to Marilyn's. But, this was the first time I really went back and I listened to some Diana interviews, and I felt like Debicki just was the best impersonation you could get. Without it feeling like a mockery or tacky, it was just so elegant and sophisticated and feminine. I mean, it was just a phenomenal, she looks the part too. Although Debicki is way taller than actually Diana was. Elizabeth Debicki is very tall. And so, Diana was tall, but not that tall. But she was towering over Dominic West. Dominic West is 6 feet. So Debicki is a tall, especially in heels. But Diana, definitely had a similar frame. Although, I think it's important. My mom pointed this out that, my mom obviously was a little more aware of this, that, Diana had a little bit more weight on her in the 90s than she did in parts of the 80s when she was younger. And I think that, portraying Diana as bone thin in the 90s, it's more just because that's just how Debicki is, but it's not the most accurate portrayal. There's another member of the royal family who is not portrayed accurately in season 6 and 5 that I might get to. It's the Queen Mother. She's portrayed very thin and frail. Apparently, she was quite a healthy, let's just say, healthily fed woman. And so I feel like in season 5 and 6, she's not portrayed very well. That's the Queen Mother, played by Marsha Warren in seasons 5 and 6. Anywho, the system. Yeah, I think we can all agree that this episode is not one that deserves to be watched multiple times. I'm sorry, I've seen it twice, bits of it 3 times. It was enough for me. It's just not the strongest. The third least favorite episode, I think, is going to probably have to go to Alma Mater. So we have an episode from season 6. This is the episode where William meets Catherine at St. Andrews in Scotland. I think the reason why this episode falls flat is mainly because it's trying to tell a story in 45 minutes that should really be stretched out over at least 2 episodes, maybe even 3. I mean, the Catherine and Will romance is just completely accelerated to a kind of unbelievable level. Again, I kind of do understand that Peter Morgan only had certain amount of episodes, and I'm very glad he didn't completely sacrifice other storylines in season 6 to beef up William and Kate. In some ways, I'm okay with sacrificing their love story being told in a more elaborate and sort of realistic way. But the beginning of it is in episode 7 of season 6, and then the end of their relationship is depicted in episode 9. So it's really a 2-episode arc. And episode 6 is setting all of that up, how William and Kate ended up kind of falling for each other. And of course, it introduces the mother who, in real life, was kind of a Kris Jenner herself, setting up and kind of pimping out her own daughter, to go to the same college at the same time as William and, beef up that childhood, that teenage crush that she always had on Will's. So, I mean, a lot of people are critiquing it for sort of making it seem like a fairy tale, which, yeah, William and Kate on the surface look like a fairy tale couple, but reality is never that glossy. It took a long time for them to get married, and there's a reason for that. So I'm not going to get too much into that, but, it glosses over a lot of things. You're sort of like, how did Kate suddenly be okay so quickly with not only falling in love with Will, when it seemed like she was already kind of over him by the time she went to St. Andrews, but also the fact that her mother completely is meddling with everything. I mean, she completely forgives her mother as far as we're concerned after finding out about all of this. And it's just sort of like, my God, I would drop out of school and and she must really still have wanted him. I think that's what's underimplied. She was mad that she got, bamboozled a little bit, but at the end of the day, she was like, actually, you know what, Mom, I do kind of want him, and it is convenient that we go to the same school, and he does seem to like me. I'm gonna rope him in at a fashion show, and that's the next part of the story. But anywho, Alma Mater is very Gossip Girl. It's not so much the kind of subject matter that I think Peter Morgan is used to kind of portraying. It's we're in the early 2000s at a university in the UK. We're talking drugs, loud parties, and modern EDM dance music. It just doesn't really fit with the sort of image of The Crown as a show, even though I'm glad that he's not trying to make it more austere than it is. This is what party culture is in university. But I think the contrast of, university being this crazy party place and then the royal palaces being so drab and sort of dreary, I don't know. It's an interesting juxtaposition, but it makes it's almost too stark. And it makes the show feel kind of uneven. So yeah, I think that the college romance, he said, she said, kind of banter that this episode is filled with is not the most interesting to someone who would be interested in the, socio-political machinations of the royal family and the government of the UK. So it sort of dials a lot of the stakes back. There is also something on this episode that I do think is somewhat of a continuity error, which involves Princess Margaret. This episode would be set around 2001. It starts out in 2000 with his 18th birthday. Well, it actually starts out in 1997 with Diana briefly meeting Kate Middleton, and she gets an autograph from her in London. But we see Will turning 18, and the mom, listening closely on the radio, like, where's he going to go to college so that she can plan Kate's future trajectory. And then they both take a gap year. Coincidence? And then in 2001, in the fall, they both start at St. Andrews. And so the Christmas and that semester are sort of what's really shown. And then the end of the episode is them sort of Kate saying, are you going to actually drop out of university? And he says, no, I'm going to stay. And she says, I'm going to stay too. But Margaret is shown at the piano in December of 2001, very able-bodied, singing Christmas carols. Well, if you watch the next episode and you're following the timelines, Margaret would not have looked that well by the fall of 2001. Margaret would have been basically bedridden, largely blind, and unable to really speak. Margaret died 2 months later after that Christmas, and it was a long, slow, painful decline. We'll talk about that in a future episode. But anyway, I just had to throw that out. That's another reason why I ding points from this episode. Anywho, let's get to the fourth least favorite episode of this. Episode 7 of Season 5, No Woman's Land. This is obviously a play on the phrase "no man's land," and this is an episode about Princess Diana, that we see Princess Diana really start to explore what life without Charles might look like. They're not divorced yet. This episode takes place in 1995, thereabouts, and is her sort of in the deep clutches of paranoia, feeling that the walls are closing in around her. Her phones are being hacked. She doesn't trust that she thinks her car might be tampered with. There's a scene where she thinks her brakes might have failed her. I'm not sure if that actually happened. By the way, I do want to make a precursor here. This video is not going to be a video where I just go and fact check everything, because I don't know. I've read a lot about The Crown and historians fact checking everything, but I haven't read it all, and some of it has just gone in and out. And so I don't really want to spend too much time talking about some of that kind of aspect of the show. I really do want to talk about the show more as a show and what's being presented to us, rather than rating them based on, well, this is the most historically inaccurate documentation of what happened. Because that would be a different rating. You could have a historian rate the show from least accurate episodes to most accurate. That's not what this rating is. I'm taking it into consideration with certain aspects that I feel are important, but there are times where I feel like, to serve the narrative of a story, twisting a few things here and there, could be actually beneficial. There are times where that might be. There's an element in season 6 where I feel like that they time jump with some things a little bit, and I actually don't hate it so much. I think it serves the story better than to chronologically have everything in the order it had happened. But anywho, in this episode, Diana finds Martin Bashir, who is kind of predatorily kind of coercing Diana to divulge all of her fears and worries about the British intelligence services. Her brother is also getting caught up in this, but then he realizes that this guy, Martin Bashir, might not be as credible with some of his what he's saying, these claims that he's making about MI5 and MI6 to Diana and him, and he's saying, something's not adding up. You shouldn't trust this guy. But Diana is so, torn and unsure that she sort of feels like she has no other choice. And Martin Bashir is just trying so hard to make sure that he's the one to snag the tell-all interview rather than another network, like in the US, for example, or somewhere else. And she feels it's important for it to be the BBC. And so I blame both parties, and that's a historical conversation, but, Martin Bashir has been exposed to have faked documents to coerce Diana to give these testimonies under an interview that, one could argue was illegally obtained based on hindsight information and investigation. That all came out not too long ago. So it's great that The Crown had that in hindsight so that they could make this episode. This is what I mean by like Peter Morgan waiting, because it took so long for Martin Bashir to be exposed. And, if he had made this episode 5 or 10 years earlier, he wouldn't have had that full picture, and it would have been a very different story that we're being told here. But what do I not like this episode? I think the writing really does Diana dirty. I feel that Elizabeth Debicki just won the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress in a Drama Series Television for playing Diana in seasons 5 and season 6. It's actually a little unclear for me which season she won for. I'm presuming it was for season 6, but the eligibility windows for the Golden Globes versus the Emmys are all scrambled in my brain right now, especially since the Emmys are taking place right around the same time as the Golden Globes, but they have a different eligibility window. So certain seasons will be eligible for that weren't. It's too much for me. I definitely think Elizabeth Debicki is given better material to work with on season 6, whereas on season 5, I feel like the writers let her down. Diana Debicki does a phenomenal job embodying Diana. Now, keep in mind, I was 4 years old when Diana died. I have no living memory of seeing her, in real time. I've only seen interviews. I've seen the Panorama interview. I never actually saw that much actual photo or especially vocal, presentation of her beyond all representations we've seen in Hollywood. That I feel like Debicki is the first one that it's just like, wow, like this is so uncanny how much she looks like her and how much she talks like her. As far as I'm aware, again, I'm not a Diana-phile. I don't know that much about her because, she died when I was 4 years old, and I don't really have the same, obsession to some people, I mean, I love Diana for what she represented. And anyway, this could become a whole thing. I'm not like, oh my gosh, I study Diana. I know everything about her mannerisms and I can clock every single actress. It's not like that. But I feel like Emma Corrin did a phenomenal job in season 4. This isn't a slight against Emma Corrin. They're both phenomenally doing a great job here. I also think Kristen Stewart did a pretty good job. But I think that Debicki is the cream of the crop here for Diana portrayals. I just think that the writing really lets her down. Episode 7 in season 5 is such a slog to get through. But I do feel like the episode, it's trying to paint the picture of, Diana being lost and trying to find love with Dr. Hasnat Khan, the handsome Pakistani doctor that she meets in hospital while her friend is in surgery. It's a little When Harry Met Sally. It's kind of a cute London romance, but it's glossed over with a little bit kind of formulaic rom-com dialogue. It just doesn't really land for me as being that compelling. Nothing against the actors here, but I just feel like, again, you're glossing over a story that's kind of really interesting. Summarizing it down into one episode doesn't always work. There are times where a love blooming story really works when it's shown in pretty much just one episode. Like back to the episode Beryl in season 2 with Margaret and what's his face? The name will come to me. It'll be in the description, but it's not in my brain at the moment. The photographer, the handsome photographer. They do a wonderful job of showing that relationship blossoming in the span of one episode. I wish that Diana and Hasnat Khan had gotten a similar treatment, even though it was a brief romance. After Panorama, he dipped. But yeah, No Woman's Land is just, I want more from the story. It's a slow pace to get to the Panorama interview, which is far more where the story starts to accelerate and become much more impactful. And the other critique is that I feel like even though in this episode we do get to see some of the philanthropic and sort of hand-holding that Diana would do, like going to hospitals and caring for sick children, speaking and doing public engagements like that, it reminds you of just how little you see of that in season 5. In most of season 5, Diana is in her bedroom, kind of with curtains drawn, just, really afraid of her own shadow. And I do think that makes her appear kind of weaker than maybe she really was. also far more introverted than I think Diana really was. So I don't know if it's the most accurate writing portrayal, even though, like I said, Debicki is Diana in these situations. It's not a fault on Debicki at all. What is the fifth least favorite episode for me of The Crown? Well, it was a toss up between two episodes, but I ultimately had to go with another episode from season 5, the finale episode, the closing episode, Decommissioned. This is the lowest rated episode on IMDb. The reason why I don't have it at the very bottom is because I actually do think there are a couple things about this episode that, again, it's in the bottom 5, definitely, and perhaps it could be my 4th least favorite. I don't know. This is where it landed. Um, Similarly to the Queen Victoria syndrome, we're continuing the arc of the Royal Britannia retiring. Even though I do think it's better addressed in this episode, it feels more organically brought up because we have Tony Blair. And I think Tony Blair coming into power is the interesting part of this episode. Also, the handover of Hong Kong to China from the UK. Those parts are what saved the episode for me. The scenes of Hong Kong, lowering the British flag and raising the Chinese, and Charles giving that speech, it's so haunting. And just one of those moments where you feel like you're seeing history depicted, especially with the hindsight of now we know 25 years later what's going on with Hong Kong and China. Seeing the foreshadowing in that, and it's very kind of haunting kind of depiction. This is where hindsight is so good for depicting events in the past. And it's why I, again, agree with Peter Morgan waiting a certain amount of time, similar with the Martin Bashir issue. But yes, Decommissioned has elements of some really interesting things happening. Tony Blair's ascension, one of the most progressive leading elections the UK has had for a long time, definitely in my lifetime. This is the only time the Labour Party has won so unanimously. And that was as someone who's would be voting Labour if I was a UK citizen, we've been in the trenches for 13 years. It's like, when are we going to finally get the Tories out? So watching Tony Blair's sort of meteoric success, of course, this was all post 9/11, post the war in Iraq. Keep that very much in mind. It was just so interesting to see. Because again, I was too young, But yeah, overall, I think Decommissioned, I can see why it's the lowest rated on IMDb. But, for what it is, it has some interesting moments that I'm very glad Peter Morgan kept in. What I don't like about the episode is, even though I understand it's foreshadowing Dodi Fayed and his relationship with his current girlfriend and his father, again, it's sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel, showing him doing cocaine on an airplane. Do we really need to see that? I don't know, maybe we do. But for me, it made me not like his character, which I suppose that's kind of the point. But, you really start to feel Dodi is, in Moo Moo, you were starting to root for him. And then in this episode, you're like, Dodi. And I don't know if that could have been portrayed differently, because then you really try and rectify his image in season 6 by the end. They really do. But I don't, they spend a little too much time focused on the Fayeds. I understand why they do, but it's at the expense of other things going on with the royal family in the 90s. Moo Moo was a phenomenal episode. I'll get to that. But I don't know. Decommissioned has a little too much setting up for the final season, which I understand why they're doing it, but, So those are my 5 least favorite. And boy, I've already been talking for a half an hour. So we're going to get to my favorite episodes. Some of these, pardon me, I might be going through a little faster just in the interest of time, because I have 15 I want to talk about here. These are going to be ranked from, least to most favorite, but remember, I love all of these episodes. It's very hard to rank. Coming in at number 15, we have the Balmoral Test, which is the, I believe, 2nd episode of season 4. This is the episode that Diana, played by Emma Corrin at the time in that season, a very young Diana, she's like, 20 years old, barely 20, is entering the royal family circle for the first time. And the Balmoral Test is an idea of if you can really stomach being in the royal family. And if you can stomach being close with them and their culture and traditions. And they pair Diana going to Balmoral for the first time with Margaret Thatcher, played by Gillian Anderson, brilliantly in season 4. And so we get to know Margaret Thatcher in the first episode of the season, but this is the episode where she really starts to shine. She goes with her husband, She goes right before Diana, so they're not there at the same time, but it sort of acts like they were. And oh, it is so wonderfully awkward how Margaret Thatcher looks at Balmoral and all of the completely, to her view, backwards aristocratic. Uh, I mean, it's interesting. I am not a Thatcher person. I'm not a Thatcher fan. If you know my politics, Thatcher kind of screwed up the UK. Thatcher and Reagan. Oh boy, talk about the dream team. But at the same time, I do believe that Maggie Thatcher had a point, at least in how Gillian Anderson was portraying her, about the royal family being completely out of touch with reality as we were entering the 80s. I think that that is such a, important observation that no other prime minister before Maggie had ever kind of come to, at least in this way. And so it was very important for Maggie Thatcher to sort of go, this country needs, a reckoning. And I kind of, I get why she won the election because that was the kind of mindset at the time. And it's such an interesting clash of cultures presented. I love the scene where Gillian Anderson is trying to partake in these parlor games. One ibble dibble and two dibble ibble. I've been saying that in my head ever since the episode aired. It's a really funny episode, and it just wonderfully shows these women kind of interacting with the monarchy. It shows Maggie Thatcher and a young Diana. And of course, Diana does amazing with the Balmoral test. She passes with flying colors. She helps shoot a buck on the moors. Maggie Thatcher, can't even wear the proper shoes to go walking on the moors. I'd be more like Maggie, I gotta be honest with you. I love the countryside, but I don't love duck shooting and fox hunting and stag shooting. That's not something I'd be down with. In the royal family, you kind of have to do that kind of stuff. Kind of really sad. Anyway, a really charming episode. Coming in at 14, we have another season 4 episode. This is episode, oh God, I can't remember. Is this episode 5? I believe it is. It's called Fagin. Or no, it's episode 3. No, it's episode 5. Episode 5, Fagin. This is about a man named Fagin who broke into Buckingham Palace in 1981. This is a crazy story that I had never heard of until the show aired. And I just think that this episode does such a wonderful job portraying the haves and the have-nots. In the 80s, Britain is really starting to economically suffer for people who are not on Maggie Thatcher's upward momentum, ladder, so to speak. For everyone else, you are, being crushed under the weight of capitalism. And so, which is a kind of newer thing to the UK. Post the war, there was a big kind of socialist push, they would be called today. And then in the 80s, Thatcher really did rein in all that socialized spending. Welfare checks, no one should get those. And so it does a great job at showing, the potential rift between the Queen and Maggie Thatcher. And the scene where he breaks into her bedroom is just so, you just are on the edge of your seat. The curtain being drawn and across Olivia Colman's bed. Olivia Colman is the Queen in this episode. And it's just so wonderfully done. And of course, we don't actually know what was said between these two figures. It's all conjecture. But I think they do a pretty good job at least for the continuity of the show's storyline, saying what might have been said. Yeah, it probably went down differently. I think the Queen probably didn't say as much to Fagin. I think she probably might have asked him how he was, shown to care a little bit, but she probably didn't, really try to connect with him about socioeconomic problems under Maggie Thatcher. I don't see that really happening with QE2. But be that as it may, it made sense to foreshadow another episode where Maggie and the Queen have a super showdown over politics. That's about apartheid in South Africa. That's a later episode. It's not on this list, but it's a good one as well. The finale is at number 13 of the entire series, Sleep, Dearie, Sleep. I see a lot of people gassing this up as one of the best episodes of season 6, and I agree that it's good. But I'm not entirely sure that this episode deserves to be any higher than at 13. In fact, I knew it would be in the top 15, but I almost put it at the bottom of the 15. This is the longest episode of The Crown. It is 72 minutes. It's like a mini movie. And I feel that this episode is obviously the most modern And so it does a lot of conjecture. It does a lot of opening up what the meaning of the royal family is to the audience. And of course, what really sells this episode are the final scenes in the funeral, where the Queen sort of has a foreshadowing of her own funeral and walks out of Windsor Cathedral to this, it's just this beautiful music. If you watch my best songs of the 2023 video, Sleep Dearie Sleep played on the bagpipes, which is a lament from Scotland, that, you know, is played at her funeral in real life, is interpreted by Martin Phipps so beautifully in the orchestral version of this score. But there's also the cameos of Claire Foy and Olivia Colman, who played the youngest and middle-aged versions of Queen Elizabeth, plus a version of her in her teenage years, played by, I forget the actress's name. Please forgive me, it'll be in the bottom. But these are wonderful cameos that, you know, as a longtime fan of The Crown, you're just dying to see. And I think they were wonderful. I knew that when Olivia Colman came in, and it really shocked me, I didn't expect it. Olivia Colman was the devil on one shoulder saying, abdicate, you know, you're old enough already, you don't want a ton of, you know, old, decrepit monarchs on the throne. Because, you know, Charles ain't getting any younger. And then I knew as soon as they would have Olivia Colman's queen be that side of her shoulder, they would have Claire Foy come in and be the voice of reason to tell her to not abdicate. Because the whole premise of the episode is she going to abdicate at the wedding of Camilla and Charles, which we also see portrayed, which we knew was coming. We knew the season would end with Charles and Camilla's wedding. It was a good place to end because that is sort of the end of a big chunk of the story of drama that started back in season 3 with Charles and Camilla. That whole drama lasted 4 seasons. And then, you know, yeah, the Queen doesn't die for another 20 years, but that's a whole other can of worms that Peter Morgan will want to open up with William and Harry. So, anywho, maybe one day. But not, it's too soon right now. So, but that being said, I think that the cameos are the best parts of the episode. We do get Harry with his Nazi uniform. It needed to be shown. They do kind of, you know, like a lot of parts of the season, like go through it very quickly. But, you know, I think they show what needed to be shown. Reading Prince Harry's memoir, I'm glad I read it before seeing this episode, because it gives me a lot more context, and obviously makes me think less harshly about Prince Harry at the time, even though I still think it is the stupidest thing he has ever done, and he should have known better. But I'm going to be honest, I really am not surprised that he, given his lack of studiousness at school, let's just say, and the fact that he was not prioritized with his education like his brother was, being the spare, and the fact that before social media, before the day and age of cancel culture and PC politics of 2005, this sort of context and conversation is something he just really probably was ignorant about. He's a 20-year-old rich British white kid who knows about World War II, but only on a surface level. And I don't find it too hard to believe that in 2005 he would make that mistake. But also, as they point out, he was woefully unlucky to get photographed, even though that's not an excuse. He should never have done it, and he would never today. Anywho, I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm just saying, you know, it was a long time ago. I know that's hard to hear because it's like, it was 2005. No time is too long ago. But you have to remember, before social media, how stupid a lot of young men who don't care about history are. I don't know. You know, they live in a bubble. They live in a bubble. And I do blame Charles. I do not think that Charles was present enough as a father to instill in both his sons a sort of studiousness that might have avoided something like this. Anywho, so Sleep Dearie Sleep, what a way to send out the show. But I almost feel like this episode was always going to be too weighty, going to crash under its own weight a little bit. Because there are parts of the episode that don't feel like it should be the finale. Feels like there's so much more of the story to be told. We're only just getting into Harry and William's dynamic, which is, you want to dive into that more as, you know, seeing current dramas unfold and after having read Harry's memoir. we're only just getting the glimmer of it here. But, the episode can only do so much. It has to wrap up, the story arc of the season, but also the story arc of Charles and Camilla. And it has to pull back to all of, seasons 1 and 2 as well with Queen Elizabeth, and Philip. And there's some great dialogue about the future of the monarchy. I'll talk about that when I get to the very end. I'll come back to that last scene. Um, Jonathan Pryce is phenomenal in that episode. So is Imelda Staunton. I feel like the end of season 6 is when we really get to see Imelda Staunton show her true abilities as princess, as Queen Elizabeth. I feel like the writing again was letting her down in a lot of season 5 and early season 6 because she was kind of just the disapproving grandmother sitting at the newspaper going, "Tisk tisk, children today." She wasn't being given a lot. Peter Morgan finally, in the last couple episodes, gave her some real emotional depth. At number 12, we have Creediker, which is the 10th episode of season 3. This is one of the Margaret episodes. This is the episode when Helena Bonham Carter is playing Princess Margaret, and her marriage is on the rocks. It's about to be over to the photographer. Forget his name. Again, it'll be in the description. And she finds out that he's seeing someone else. And she's like, you know what? Screw him. I'm going to go with my friends. First to Scotland, where she meets a very young, attractive man named Roddy. And against her better judgment, starts to fall in love with him and takes him to her residence on the private island of Mystique in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. And she has this whirlwind kind of basically affair that unfortunately gets tagged in the newspapers. And when they're found out, the family has to reel her back in. And then it becomes the catalyst for their relationship with her photographer husband, who she does have children with. I do find it very interesting that they don't depict Margaret's children at all in The Crown. They're referenced in this episode about how, he has children as well, that he is failing in this marriage, not just her. That's one of the few times we ever get any glimpse that Margaret had children. If you didn't know history, like I was kind of, and you didn't Wikipedia, you'd be like, gosh, it's a shame Margaret never got to have children. No, she did. But the show certainly doesn't spend any time focusing on that. But, maybe it was best. It doesn't, not everything needs to be covered. That's sort of like, okay. So yeah, it's a really heartbreaking episode because at the end it shows Margaret not really taking her own life, but taking a lot of drugs to, calm herself, anti-anxiety medications and such, to a reckless level that nearly kills her. And so there's a wonderfully touching scene between Margaret and Elizabeth, foreshadowing when Margaret does eventually die, and Elizabeth saying, "I could never think about life without you. Don't you dare get me in that position ever again." Really tragic to think about. Which then segues into her first jubilee. I can't remember what it was called when it was 25 years on the throne, but she finally has her first real big jubilee, and in 1977. Anyway, it's a wonderful episode. I love the use of the pop music in there. It's very 70s. I feel like you get such a sense of Margaret's character. She's such a free spirit who's being dealt such an unfair hand in love, and also in life in general. I don't blame her for smoking up the place because, she was in a golden cage. She could, there was so little she could do, even though I am jealous of her, privilege and status. I mean, she was not wanting financially for anything, but I can imagine it was a very suffocating existence to not be able to marry the man you loved and, then have the next man you fall in love with treat you like this. And even have the family not entirely take your side at the beginning. I mean, it's like poor Margaret, she just can't catch a break. And so it's just such a great, Helena Bonham Carter just steals the show here. All of the Margarets are some of the best actors on the program, along with Elizabeth Debicki as Princess Diana. Vanessa Kirby, Helena Bonham Carter, and Leslie Manville are all knockout of the park performances. At number 11, we have Smoke and Mirrors, which is episode 6 of season 1. This is the coronation episode And obviously, this is a monumental moment about a show about the crown. You can't not include the coronation. And I think that the subject matter is more of what makes it such a memorable episode for me rather than the actual writing. But come on, Peter Morgan does such a phenomenal job with sort of the tension brewing between Philip and Elizabeth over the coronation. How he has to kneel before her. He's already had to give up his surname, he's had to give up his job, his home, so many things for this woman. And now, oh my gosh, poor Philip. I know, right? The patriarchy. He has to bow before his wife in front of the entire country. And I think that that's just such an important conversation that they would have probably had that needed to be shown to show the dynamic, not only of their relationship, but of what it's like to be a man in a patriarchal system that is actually showing how the patriarchy negatively can impact men. Because there are certain reasons why Prince Philip could never be king, because kings outrank a queen. And so the few times that there have been queens in the UK, there aren't kings sitting beside them, they're princes. Whereas, when you have a king, he has a queen next to her. It's a weird twist of patriarchy that actually negatively impacts men when they're married into the royal family. I think it's a very interesting thing. Obviously, I don't support the patriarchy. It far more hurts women than it ever hurts men, but men do get caught up in it as well. So, with that being said, I think the modernization of showing television for the coronation was a really interesting story to tell, and showing how showing the coronation through the lens of 1950s television and studio equipment is really interesting. And just the costumes, seeing all of the royal family in Westminster Abbey. I mean, it brought tears to my eyes seeing the anointing. It really does the best it can to depict how, what the crown is meant to espouse, which is divine ordinance upon earth, which, again, I have problems with. I don't think belongs in the modern world. But if you're going to do it, you might as well make it pomp and circumstance. And I do think that, especially for Queen Elizabeth, depicting her coronation, it's a magical event to witness. It's a divine event. And I think the show does a phenomenal job at depicting that. Coming in the top 10, we've got Gunpowder. This is episode 8 of season 5. One of the strongest episodes of season 5 because this is the panorama interview. All of that premise and build-up from No Woman's Land finally pays off. The way that we see the chairman of the BBC get into the fact that, and this all really happened, the fact that, he's planning something he doesn't actually have that much say in the BBC, but he definitely wants to exert his influence. The fact that he wants to do something to commemorate the Queen because she's had a rough go of it. He's a staunch monarchist. And meanwhile, Martin Bashir is cooking up this panorama interview, which could potentially destroy the monarchy. And the interactions of the middleman between Martin Bashir and this figurehead is just so riveting to see. Because you're really seeing the old world and the new world just clash. There's some great inner dialogue where, they talk about the role of the monarchy in Britain today. And how the one sides are for and against have interesting arguments to support its continued existence or the dissolution of it and becoming of a republic. It's such a wonderful episode. And then, of course, you actually have the episode, the interview itself, alongside Guy Fawkes. I had no idea she did it on Guy Fawkes night. And the fireworks, Prince William, learning more about Guy Fawkes Day, and how it was a plot to kill the king and he's going to be king. So it's just, there are so many story beats in this episode that interweave so wonderfully to create a narrative that Peter Morgan does wonderfully with. And then we end the episode, just as we begin, with Queen Elizabeth getting frustrated with her TV set. She's finally had to get a cable box. And there's all these channels now that she's never heard of, and she just wants to watch racing, and the BBC. And, her grandchildren are showing her cartoons, like Bugs Bunny and The Simpsons. And it's just it's the first time the modern world really enters Buckingham Palace in such a way. I'm talking the modern world. I'm talking the 90s. And Peter Morgan displays it in such an interesting way in that regard. I just love that the episode starts and ends with her looking sort of despondently at a TV with, you know, cable TV programming bullshit streaming on it. Because Gunpowder was that, you know, I mean, the Panorama interview was something on the TV that really upset her. And the metaphor of all of the complications of running it, watching her old favorite true programs on the TV, which is so much more complicated for her now, is similar. She's frustrated by the modernization of England. And you feel for her, even though as a modernist myself, you know, I'm kind of like, girl, you get with the program. But there's just some interesting grandma grandson moments with William, and also great grandmother, because the Queen Mother has some lines in there talking about how she remembers the first broadcast on TV. And, you know, the Queen Mother's story is so fascinating. But I will say, like I said, Marsha Warren, I don't think was the best fit. I'm nothing against the actress. I just think she's too slight. And then also the dialogue they give her, particularly in season 6, I think is kind of insulting. She kind of just gets these silly little lines thrown in here and there that make her sound completely out of touch, which maybe is accurate, maybe is somewhat accurate, but like a complete imbecile. And so I think it's a little bit demeaning to her. I think that the other two actresses who played the Queen Mother in seasons 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 much better embodied her. Again, I've never actually watched an interview about the Queen Mother. I don't know how she speaks or talks. This is obviously Elizabeth's mother, Queen Elizabeth, who died at the age of 101, which is pretty incredible. So she's in her mid-90s in these scenes, very elderly, but she's not that thin. My dad, as a British person, can attest to that, who is very much aware of all of this. At number 9, we have Tusog Cymru. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but that is Welsh, and it is, I know Cymru stands for Wales. I've been to Wales myself. This is an episode about the Prince of Wales's investiture. This is a great episode where Josh O'Connor really gets to step into Charles in season 3. And we get to really, unfortunately, see the lack of love from his mother. Queen Elizabeth don't look too good in this episode. Yeah, there was not a lot of hands-on parenting, and, you know, there was a very cruel kind of cold shoulder that was given to Charles when he needed emotional support in those early years. And I think that impacted how he treats his own children and Diana. It's a really unfortunate cycle that gets perpetuated. But this is a really interesting story about how, you know, he was sent to Wales to learn Welsh for a semester so that he could speak Welsh. But not only that, but you know, at his investiture, but not only that, because it shows that he cares. The Prince of Wales is a kind of colonialist title. Wales is a colonized part of the UK. It's a colonized sect of Celtic people, the Welsh people. And their language, although it's thriving to a certain extent in better shape than other parts of the UK that are Gaelic, that are Celtic in origin, it's still, you know, struggling under the Anglo-Saxon hegemony. And so, you know, it's a really interesting, there's a couple episodes that do a really great job of spotlighting England's relationship and the Crown's relationship with the country of Wales. It does have its own parliament, it is its own country, and yet it is also not independent. So, you know, it is part of the United Kingdom. Okay, then we have episode 8 of season 6, Ritz. This is Margaret's death episode. There are some really killer Margaret episodes, as I said, Creed Occur being one of them. This episode is gut-wrenching. I was really intrigued to see how they were going to handle Margaret's death, because it is a tragic sort of fall from grace. Margaret's very unhealthy lifestyle of being very liberal with booze and with smoking finally really did catch up to her at around her 70th year in the early 2000s. And so we witnessed her having a series of strokes. I had no idea they were going to go that far into it. I mean, we see multiple strokes take place on camera very viscerally. I mean, in some ways I was worried, especially for my parents who don't like kind of piercing, ringing in your ear kind of sounds. I was like, is this going to be uncomfortable for my parents? Because it's a very, you know, almost headache-inducing sequence where we see the ringing in her ears getting louder and louder, and she's struggling in her bedroom. That scene in particular is it's gonna stay with me for the rest of my life. Like seeing so well acted, so well shot, so well done. It's so hard to watch at the same time. But we also, again, get to see Margaret and Elizabeth revisit their very strong relationship. And I love using the device of the Ritz Hotel and the VE Day in 1945, the time that Elizabeth let loose in the basement of the Ritz with those dancers from Harlem. You gotta stay away from those. Yeah, some subtle racism, but this is the 1940s in England. What do you expect? And Margaret being so proud of her little sister for kind of showing up and letting loose and dancing with strange American men, doing the jitterbug. Oh, the jitterbug. So, I mean, it's a really endearing kind of way, and it's a great way to frame how Margaret, in her later years, was just romanticizing that moment. You can understand why. Margaret spent her whole life seeing Elizabeth kind of be closed and uptight, and her being, in comparison, the one who looks even crazier than she is because of it. And she, doesn't resent her for it in the end. You'd think that Margaret, in her later years, would be more pissed off at Elizabeth for some things. But Margaret always comes back on side and is always there to support her, no matter what. Till the very end, as she says in that beautiful scene in front of Buckingham Palace, where, they're walking home after the party of VE Day, conspicuously with no one around, which I think is very unrealistic. It looks more like a dream sequence at that point than a realistic depiction of what might have happened, because suddenly it's like London's been vaporized. It's just like, where is everyone? But it almost looks post-apocalyptic. But it's still a very interesting device that Peter Morgan uses to show in her later years she is just replaying these memories to sort of warm her heart, knowing that she's at the end of her life. There's some beautiful kind of witty lines. I'd rather die than do exercise. Margaret has always been relatable, okay? She's always been the most relatable royal, at least depicted in this show. And I didn't know anything about Margaret, and now I'm such a fan of her. To be honest with you, I think if I did a deep dive into Margaret, I might not be as impressed. But, Vanessa Kirby and Helena Bonham Carter and Leslie Manville are such divas on this show that you just consolidating them into this woman that is Margaret is like, she's like a deity. She's like this diva, she's this real presence who is almost kind of like, she's almost like a Joan Rivers kind of, she's getting to that like kind of level of iconicism and wittiness at the end that just makes her so, you can't look away, so endearing and so electrifying. And I don't know if Margaret herself was quite that. I don't know, I think she was. If history is anything to say, she was definitely a shower. She was an exhibitionist. Elizabeth was much more behind closed doors. It's a gut-wrenching episode. A reminder to be very careful about your health and not be reckless with it. It is so sad because, she was 5 years younger than Elizabeth, and she could still be alive today. She would only be in her early 90s. If she, but it's roll of the dice. Living to 70, is still a good run, I suppose. She definitely took the motto, I'm going to be here for a short time, but a fun time, not a long time and a dull time. So, there you go. All in all, a phenomenal episode. Leslie Manville deserves Golden Globe and Emmy nominations for this, but I don't know if she's going to get them because we already have those nominations. Golden Globes have already happened. She wasn't nominated. And I don't know if the Emmys, I don't think they're going to get it for her next year. I don't know. Maybe they will. I don't know if they're rewarding this past season or not at the current Emmys that are about to take place right as I'm filming this video. Hello from the future here. I realized as I was editing this video that I completely forgot to talk about one of the 15 episodes. So I am in different attire because I just didn't bother to change back into the old clothes when I filmed this a few days ago. So bear with me. But at number 7, we have the episode Marionettes, which is from season 2. And this is an episode where Queen Elizabeth is under fire for potentially making tone-deaf comments at a factory where she talks about, where she insinuates that the average ordinary working class person of Europe is dredged in menial labor And it makes a tone deaf statement that makes it that's a little demeaning and patronizing. And so one member of parliament decides to take it upon himself to criticize the queen. And, the queen is very popular, even in the beginning of her reign. And so this is like an affront to Elizabeth and her family, and they don't understand where he's coming from and why he's calling, why he's saying such belittling things about her in the press, about how she speaks, how stiff and awkward she is. But once he finally gets to speak on this program called Impact and explain himself a little bit better, he, turns out and he is someone from the left who, tends to have slightly less monarchy-friendly views. He explains that he is a monarchist, despite what people might think, and that he wants the monarchy to survive. He just feels that these changes need to be made. And so Elizabeth actually invites him to the palace covertly, so that no one can really know that they actually met. It's under the guise of her meeting with her private secretary, but she actually meets him in a room. She sort of appears out of nowhere, out of a small closet, completely catching him by surprise. And she asks him for 3 starts and 3 stops. And, maybe it's 5 starts and 5 stops. I can't quite remember. But he gives a ton of suggestions to create a more modern monarchy. Some of these things are, in fact, implemented today. Being more friendly towards divorced persons, inviting more people into the palace, and televising the Christmas message. And so at the end of the message, we get to see Elizabeth very nervously sitting in front of a camera, broadcasting the very first televised version of the Christmas address. Now, the Christmas address was something that her grandfather started, and her father carried it on, and then she had done over the radio. And of course, Queen Elizabeth has continued doing the Queen's Speech ever since, to the day of her death in 2022. And of course, King Charles is now continuing that tradition. So throughout this whole episode, we just get a really interesting insight again into how formidable Elizabeth is in the face of controversy and when people are attacking her character. Claire Foy is just so compelling in this episode, one of Claire Foy's best. And I think that it's a really interesting story that needs to be told, that again, I obviously knew nothing of, and how conflating views of the monarchy can actually come to a middle ground. It's a very important kind of story to be told. And again, where Peter Morgan and the writers do a really great job at being nuanced and balanced in their perspective on pro and cons for the monarchy. And so overall, I think it's a very well-written episode, like all of these are, and it deserved to be included on this list. At number 6, I have Dear Mrs. Kennedy. This is from season 2, and I believe it is episode 8 or 9. And this is the episode where the royal family is introduced to the magnanimous Kennedy family, JFK and his wife, Jackie. And this episode, I mean, it's always interesting seeing the Crown tackle events in history that aren't directly related to the royal family. So seeing the perspective of the Kennedys from Elizabeth and her family's point of view was quite interesting. I mean, the Kennedys have a reputation, and Jackie in particular is so glamorous and someone that I think I could easily see Elizabeth being jealous of. They were a contemporaries of each other. And this episode does a really good job at showing Elizabeth's insecurity and then how she overcomes it. And so there's a lot of character building in this episode, particularly centered around Elizabeth and Jackie. And then, of course, we see the Kennedy assassination and the impact that it had on the monarchy. So it was a really well-written episode. I mean, it really does look behind the curtain at the Kennedys' relationship. It definitely makes you want to see a similar kind of story, a similar kind of adaptation of the Kennedy dynasty, which there have been, but not to the level of The Crown before, at least not in modern cinema. So I'll be interested to see that. The Crown has supposedly greenlit a Kennedy kind of docudrama, biopic drama, that will explore that time period for them. And They're obviously trying to chase the success of The Crown if that's what they're trying to do. Okay, we have the top 5. These 5 episodes could easily be number 1. All of them are phenomenal. And it was pretty clear to me that these 5 episodes jumped out right away as no-brainer inclusions on this list. First, we have Pater Familias, which I actually believe this might be episode 9 of season 2. Or no, I believe this is episode 8. One of those. And this episode is about a young Prince Charles going to boarding school in Scotland, a school called Gordonston, which is a very hard knocks, kind of rough education, rough wilderness education for young boys, which Philip insists on against Elizabeth's desire. She wants him to go to Eton. It would be a little bit more his scene, his crowd. I certainly wouldn't last at Gordonston either. I sympathize with Charles here in his upbringing. I'm a soft child, okay? Philip would not have liked having me as a son. And I think that's very well illustrated here on the show about Philip's temperament and Charles's temperament and how they're at odds with each other. But yeah, the episode is also a lot of character building for Philip because we equally get equal amount of time with Philip going to Gordonston in the 1930s. So we get to see him kind of growing up. And it's a really great kind of character snapshot for Philip and his past and his history. We get a little bit more into Philip's very complicated familial history. I mean, he has very scattered ancestry, a lot of ties to Nazi Germany through his sisters, which is kind of unfortunate. But, you know, he's not responsible for who they marry. And unfortunately, a lot of them died in a plane crash. And so we get to see, you know, that impact that it had on him at such a young age. So it's not only, I mean, about Charles, it's so much about Philip. And it's like a mini movie because by the end you feel like you've gone through the entire character arc and sort of story exploration that you see in most big budget biopics. Because it is just absolutely a most stirring film. I mean, it's so wonderfully scored and orchestrated. There's a bit of like, you know, with the final, you know, race and how Charles does so pitifully. But you really root for Charles from this episode. And it's an important groundwork episode for Charles as a person in the series to come. So overall, a magnificent way of showing a period that could have easily been glossed over by the show. You know, he could have just gone off to school and that was that. We didn't have to see any of it. But the way they depicted it, plus the gorgeous cinematography and the music, which is absolutely phenomenal. At number 4, we have Assassins. An interesting title for an episode of this nature, of the subject matter it is about. This is an episode about Winston Churchill, predominantly, and his failing health and his advancing age, forcing him to step down from his second go at being prime minister. You know, it's becoming, the writing is very clear on the wall. But we focus on the time that he is hiring a portrait artist to capture his likeness to be unveiled in Parliament as a birthday present. And it's not the most flattering in the end to Winston's liking. You know, there's just some of the best screenwriting on display. The interactions between the portrait artist and Winston, John Lithgow just steals the show. And there's so many great lines about aging that are universal, not just to someone who can relate to exactly being in Winston's position, because that's not a very relatable position to the common viewer. But there's so many deeper levels to it. And as an artist, I really appreciated seeing the artistic side of Winston. Now, again, I think that, you know, similar to Margaret Thatcher, this show does it's a lot more pro-Churchill than it is pro-Thatcher. At the end of the day, these are two conservative men who I don't necessarily align politically with. Obviously, Churchill gets all this praise for being, you know, given a lot of the credit for World War II. I think maybe he's given a little too much credit, but, you know, be that as it may, he was kind of leading the charge on, you know, the Allied side. And so I think we gloss over a lot of this because it's further back in history. But I don't mind a sanitized view of him. I still think the show does a good job at showing how crotchety he is and how out of touch he is with common people. But I still think that John Lithgow just makes him so lovable, which maybe makes it kind of hard for me because I'm just like, oh man, I don't want to root for this guy. I mean, again, I don't hate Winston Churchill like I feel animosity towards Margaret Thatcher. I just don't, I don't. Hate's a strong word. Perhaps I don't hate any UK politician as much as I hate some US politicians. But at the same time, politics aside, I think that this is a very moving, beautifully written episode that has so much metaphor in it. I mean, about Winston searching for light in this pond and trying to capture it, and it's elusive to him as being about his life and mortality and the conversations that are had around the essence of living. I mean, it's just such a probing episode that didn't again have to go there, but it did, and I'm so glad that we get such a masterpiece in not only cinematography and music, but in screenwriting. We also do see in this episode, a B-side plot of Elizabeth and her longtime friend Lord Porchester, called affectionately Porchy, um, which again is an important, secondary storyline that obviously is not quite as memorable. I think it took a few times. I mean, I completely forgot about this whole subplot to this episode when I was thinking about this episode, and I was like, there's something else in it, isn't there? But, The Crown, it didn't feel like it sacrificed the main storyline of Winston and his portrait to also spend some time talking about Elizabeth's potential, runner up for her heart. And if Philip hadn't come around, who might she have actually ended up with? It would have probably been Porchy. Um, at number 3, we have Vergangenheit. So Vergangenheit is a period of time that has already happened. So you could speak of it as the past tense. And this episode is all about the past because we get to really dissect the Duke of Windsor's entanglement with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. This is a really interesting episode. As someone who didn't know anything about the Duke of Windsor, and especially did not know about all these revelations that came out decades later to the public, that The Crown kind of shows how the royal family was made aware of at the time. But, historians uncovering all of these communiques Nazi Germany paperwork discover these communications between Adolf Hitler and the former king, the Duke of Windsor, who abdicated. And it causes a huge scandal, and the royal family is, Queen Elizabeth getting caught in this because she has a closer connection to the Duke of Windsor than her mother, for example. Her mother hates him. I love the dynamic between the Duke of Windsor and the rest of the family, his snide remarks, his clear, utter disdain for them, and how he monologues about them in certain episodes of season 1 and season 2, because it's a season 2 episode. Oh my God, it's just so, whether it's a bit exaggerated or not, it's so wonderfully done. But there's definitely, there's a conflict here that you do feel, I don't know, watching it, you almost feel kind of bad for the Duke of Windsor because he's dug himself into this hole. And you're battling the same thing Elizabeth's battling, which is like forgiveness. And do I forgive my uncle because, she's a Christian woman, and there's this really interesting subplot of her trying to figure out her faith by inviting Reverend Billy Graham, evangelical minister who was sweeping America at the time. And she is using him as counsel to understand how she maneuvers this, because isn't forgiveness kind of a principle of Christ? And there's a great, underlying moral message about don't, fall on, I mean, I'm not a devoutly religious person. Okay. So I'm not saying that I was like, oh my God, I feel the Reverend speaking to me here. But I do think at face value, there are some good messages here overall about, forgiving but not forgetting, or, letting someone else come to that path. It's not your responsibility. I mean, there are certain things that are irredeemable. And one could argue that communicating with and, surrendering the United Kingdom basically to Adolf Hitler is kind of irredeemable, basically. So if you go into the depth of the betrayal and the treason of what the Duke of Windsor did, Now, I'm not one who, let's get into a whole historical discussion. I did a little more research into this back at the time because I was really intrigued. I was like, gosh, I had no idea he had what drove him to this place. And I do think if you examine history from a lens of like at the time, seeing things as they were without knowing what was to come, maybe the Duke of Windsor had a valid argument to defend himself, and he tries to do that. He's like, we had no idea of the horrors that were to come. This is, of course, from the perspective of the late 1930s, before World War II broke out, or the horrors of the Holocaust. And so, if you go back into that, it's hard to know. It's hard with the perspective of history not to be, having that judgment. So there's an interesting conversation there about what would you do if you were in that position and everything. And so, yeah, especially since Wallace Simpson was even more entangled in it, that makes me a little less sympathetic to her, because I got to be honest with you, I feel so bad for Wallace Simpson. Until this episode reminds me that I'm like, but they kind of were Nazi sympathizers. And you're like, okay, maybe the royal family shutting them out is probably actually not a bad thing. But if it weren't for that, I'd feel so bad for how the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were treated by the royal family. I think it is absolutely horrendous that he was even forced to abdicate in the first place. That's I don't know if that's such a hot take anymore. Obviously, we all understand that divorce is not the kind of scandal that it was back then, and today it would not cause the same level of, constitutional crisis. He would not have had to have abdicate the throne today for loving someone like Wallace Simpson, but back then it was still that puritanical thinking. So anywho, it's a really phenomenal episode. This could have easily been at number one. I believe this is maybe perhaps the highest rated episode on IMDb, or second highest. It's just an absolutely phenomenal episode that dives into history in a way that makes it so intriguing for me. Because there's so much about that time period that it made me interested in. And I used to never kind of be that. World War II stuff just used to kind of like put me to sleep. But I don't know, the last couple biopics and shows like this I've seen, things I've read, it's gotten me more interested in that time period. The earliest 20th century was just a crazy time. Crazy time. I'm so glad that we will hopefully never go through something like that in human history again. Let's hope. All right, so finally, we have at number two. Now, honestly, normally this was going to be my number one, but then I recently rewatched my number one and I switched the order last minute. We have Aberfan. Once again, this is a situation in history in Britain that I had no idea about until watching this episode. My dad, who is British, grew up in the UK in the 60s, recalled this event like, oh yeah, you didn't know about this? And I was like, this is like our 9/11, especially for Wales. This is like the Welsh 9/11. It's not a terrorist attack. It's a bit different. This is a natural disaster. But there definitely could be fingers pointed at certain things in the government. And that episode gets to it. But it basically is a small town in Wales that was overrun by a coal mine mudslide, basically. They call it a spoil tip. A colliery spoil tip that overran and ran down the mountainside and destroyed many buildings, including a primary school, killing everyone inside. Lots of children were killed. 144 people died. So for this small town in Wales that, is already, subjugated under the British by colonialism, this brings up, a lot of political turmoil, but also a big inflection point for the Queen in her reign. This is sort of the first really tragic thing to hit British soil as she's queen, 10 years into her reign. And so she has to decide with what to do about it. Now, obviously, she doesn't initially travel there, and she regrets it. And that's very openly been stated by the Queen as one of her biggest regrets in her reign, that she sent the Duke of Edinburgh, but she didn't go herself, because at the time she thought, if I were to go to every single accident in the UK, I can't possibly do that. So I can't pick favorites and go to one and not the other, even though it's very rare that you have large scale catastrophes like this happen. So I would argue that this is definitely one you need to go to. But she finally does go, maybe about a month later, but she doesn't initially go, and it's something that, people start to really protest her for. And so it's a really interesting dilemma crisis that she has to navigate. But obviously, let's not selfishly make it all about the Queen. This is about the tragedy of what happened to these Welsh people. And the show brilliantly takes you back to that day and recreates the tragedy in such a haunting and, gut wrenching manner. So, I mean, if you honestly, I don't know, these top 3 episodes of The Crown, if you've never watched a single episode, I would recommend watching one of these 3, if not all 3, because there's sort of these isolated events episodes that are contained in their own story. There is some backstory you might need to know, but especially with Aberfan, just go in and watch it. It's like its own mini movie about this disaster. And it was just something I had never heard of before. And it just, I don't know. This is why but as someone who's been to Wales, I've not exactly been to this particular region. I've been more into North Wales, not so much South Wales. So I've never been around Aberfan before, but I mean, I was surprised I'd never heard of it. I'm just so ignorant, I think. Especially history. I just wasn't paying attention. Though I don't think this was really taught in my school. But no British child is going to not know about this. So it's definitely no Welsh child. So yeah, no, highly recommend this one. I mean, one of the most moving performances, Olivia Colman just absolutely steals the show. The way she portrays the grief and remorse and sorrow at what has occurred. So at number 1, we have Hyde Park Corner. This is episode 2 of season 1. When I recently rewatched this episode for the 3rd time, I realized just how brilliant it was, and realized that even though I knew it would be in the top 10 originally, this had to be number 1. First of all, the music is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. There's a lot in this score that is not in the soundtrack album by Rupert Gregson-Williams for The Crown Season 1. That really dismays me. I really wish I could listen to it on Apple Music, but for some reason, the soundtrack albums do not include all of the music that is portrayed on the show, and that's really disappointing to me. There are some beautiful arrangements, particularly with some African instruments and sensibilities, because this episode takes place predominantly in Kenya. It's so crazy to me, and this is true, to find out that when her father, George VI, died in his sleep, Princess Elizabeth was not only abroad, but they didn't actually know where she was. So she had gone off the reservation, so to speak, with some local tour guides to see wildlife in the savannah with her husband. And they had been in a treetop bungalow and having a beautiful romantic evening. And the show, I mean, it's like you couldn't make reality more poetic in a way, because it's just, of all the timings for this to happen, she's on basically a honeymoon again with her husband, and they're talking about how hopefully they still have many years to live together in Malta, growing their little family. That the fact that she'd have to assume the throne the next morning never would have occurred to her. But of course, George VI, in the first couple episodes of The Crown, is very sick. He has lung cancer, but they're hiding it from the public and even from his own children. And so Elizabeth departs, knowing he's not well enough to go on the tour, but having no idea that he was on death's door, which I think is really sad. But it just goes to show how the British, especially at that time, just really don't like to reveal their personal private matters. We put on a brave face and we don't, make a fuss over ourselves. So the passing of George VI, which is the last time until 2022 that a reigning monarch in the UK passed away, which I still thought was so crazy to me, because it was like, this is 1952 we're talking about. This is 70 years ago. And 70 years later, we have the passing of his daughter, Queen Elizabeth. So he dies quite young. It's quite sad. He dies in his, I believe, early 60s. And he could have lived a lot longer. Obviously, his brother lived into, I believe, his late 70s, early 80s. And outlived him by at least 2 decades, the Duke of Windsor. And obviously his wife, the Queen Mother, outlives him by 50 years, even though she was a little bit younger than him. but still, that's pretty incredible, because she lives to be 101. But the fact that, we get this symbolic kind of trip that she takes to Kenya, and there's this wonderful, in the opening scene moment where, she corrects Philip for asking what the costume this tribal chief is wearing, and she says, "Oh, it's a crown." And it's just like such beautiful foreshadowing of the essence of the show, which is that in this episode, we see the actual transference of power. It's the only episode in the entire show that we see that play out in the main narrative, because as you know, the show stops before Queen Elizabeth's death. And it hints at it in the future. I mean, again, most of the time I was watching the show, it was before Queen Elizabeth had died. So it was just thinking, like, it's been this long since this event has happened. What is it going to be like when Elizabeth dies? And of course, we all unfortunately got our answer. We knew in September of 2022. But this episode is just the best of what makes The Crown the best that it is. I don't know how else to describe it. The other so all the actors are doing a phenomenal job, but I also want to highlight the performance of the actress who plays Queen Mary. So Queen Mary is Queen Elizabeth's grandmother, who outlives her own child's life. I mean, her own son dies before she does. She dies a year later. She's quite old at this time, but she witnesses the ascension of her granddaughter to the throne. And Eileen Atkins does such a haunting job at portraying her writing this letter to Elizabeth on her landing in London from Kenya, speaking about, I mean, this is like the thesis statement for the show, about how the old Elizabeth Mountbatten is now dead, and Elizabeth Regina, which is her regnal name, is now the embodiment of that avatar that she lives in now. It really is like she is dying herself and being reborn when her father dies. And it's the same for King Charles. Officially, when Elizabeth died at that very moment, Charles no longer is Charles Windsor. He is now Charles Rex, which is his regnal name. They use this Latin suffix for king and queen. Very, again, old school, but I kind of love it. I'm not going to lie. And so it's a really profound moment, and it's impossible to imagine the pressure and burden that a 25-year-old is feeling. Elizabeth is only 25 years old, and she's taking on this responsibility. Granted, she knew it was coming. It was eventually going to come, and she'd been trained in it for the last 10 years, 15 years since the abdication. When it was suddenly her being next in line to the throne. Remember, she was not born initially first in line to the throne. The abdication changed the line of succession. But it's just absolutely phenomenal. The music, which is on the soundtrack, oh my God. And the scene of Queen Mary bowing to Elizabeth in front of the entire family, she's like literally representing death in that veil. It is the most beautiful and haunting image and scene in the film. Like, I'm just absolutely in awe of how they portrayed that. Because, Queen Mary is, and she references this in the letter, Queen Mary has witnessed so many monarchies be destroyed or, wiped off the map in the last 50 years. The early 20th century decimated Europe for monarchies. Which could be seen as a good thing, but not for someone like Queen Mary. For Queen Mary, it was like the end of an era, the end of an epoch. And she was like, this is not going to happen to the Windsor household. This is not going to happen to the throne of, to the British royal family. We are going to stay immutably in power. And, be that as it may, that has been Elizabeth's life mission. And that those echo in her thoughts throughout the entire show and the rest of her life and her reign. So, I mean, it's just an absolutely spellbinding, display of austerity that is what is involved in the monarchy on display here. And even more so than the coronation episode. Because remember, the coronation is not necessarily when she becomes king or queen. He or she becomes king or queen. It is the death of the first in line. So, and the fact that, it happens while she's, out in Kenya, like on this once in a lifetime kind of a journey and safari. You couldn't write a more poetic, coincidental kind of story arc. It feels too good to be true, but it is true. And the fact that they didn't even know where she was and they had to hide newspapers from her so that they could break it to her press secretary, could break it to her husband, and then her husband could break it to her when everyone else knows around her. I mean, it's just, you couldn't write. Fact is sometimes stranger than fiction. So there you go. What a monumental series. And I definitely just felt I needed to share my thoughts on the whole show and the episodes that really stuck with me. Again, there's tons of episodes I didn't mention. I'll shout out a couple honorable mention episodes. Shout out to Terra Nullius, Bubbykins, Anis Auribilis, Moo Moo, and Dis-moi Oui. Dis-moi Oui is from the latest season, and I think it's mostly because Elizabeth Debicki just does a phenomenal job with Diana in that episode. And the writing, I think, shows Diana as a very multifaceted person, in a more true to life form, even if they're inventing dialogue that we obviously don't know if it really occurred because we don't know those private conversations that happened the day before she died. But so many other episodes could have made this list. So those are my thoughts and those are my rankings. I'd be curious to hear yours in the comments. I really hope that we get more shows. Well, first of all, I hope Peter Morgan keeps working. I think that he truly is an auteur with these biopic type dramas. He did The Queen in 2006 with Helen Mirren. I did actually see that movie back when I was in like high school. And I rewatched it not that long ago. And I mean, I see his style. He definitely has a penchant for the royal family. But the interesting question is, how pro monarchy is this show at the end of the day? Well, I think that the best thing this show does for the monarchy is it's fair, it's nuanced, and it doesn't really give everyone completely attack one person very plainly and, kind of build up others at the expense. Now, you could argue that there is some bias. I would say that, certain characters are not given as much depth as others. Obviously, the show at the end of the day has a limited runtime, limited amount of space to talk about things, and it is predominantly about the queen, her husband, and her children, particularly her eldest, the next in line to the throne. And then Diana as well. And I know a lot of people feel like the Diana stuff from season 4 through 6 really dragged the show down. I do agree that I do feel the Diana, Charles, Camilla stuff did start to make the show feel like it had lost a little bit of its, sort of rise above it all kind of feel. I'll describe that. I mean, it did feel very soap opera, and it did feel very voyeuristic in a way that I think makes people uncomfortable because of how close to modern day it is compared to stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s. But at the same time, I don't see how they could have avoided Diana and not done that. I mean, we would have all ripped the show to shreds if it hadn't properly focused on that storyline. There's so much more that they could have shown, but at the same time, I do feel like there's possibly better ways that it could have been interwoven into the main story. In certain episodes, largely illustrated in the ones I list at the bottom here, my least favorite, I feel that the Diana Charles storyline starts to, in terms of the writing, starts to feel a little less subpar to the writing and sort of introspection and metaphor that the show is so wonderful at espousing in earlier seasons. It gets a little on the surface. And at the end of the day, it gets a little banal, I suppose, to some people. I don't know, but I think Diana represented a shock to the monarchy in that she was not kind of reading from the same playbook as someone like Elizabeth or even Margaret to a certain extent, in that she wasn't going to play by the rules. She was a modernist. She was a progressive in that regard, and she was going to be a modern 20th century British woman. And I think that it really came at odds with how the the monarchy wanted to, especially those in advisory positions. The show really, if it wants to portray any villains, Tommy Lascelles. Oh, Tommy Lascelles. What a great villain. His face is so smug when he is being such an asshole, especially when it comes to Princess Margaret and the Peter Townsend stuff. Oh, you just want to punch him in the face. But, it's so true to how probably these advisors were. I mean, the men in suits were running the show a lot of the time. It was a real concern I had with Elizabeth being so old. How much was she actually kind of in control? Or was it really just her being a puppet? The last 10 years of her reign, there's only so much a 90-year-old woman can do. And that was a concern for me. I knew she probably never would abdicate unless she had to, based on her inability to function. But at the same time, it probably would be nice if the monarchy was in the hands of people under the age of 80 for longer periods of time moving forward, which, if everyone lives to be as old as Queen Elizabeth, that's going to be a problem. And that's hinted at in the final episode. If Charles is 75 now, um, Queen Elizabeth was 75 in 1999. Uh, you know, I mean, Queen Elizabeth ends up living 23 more years. That means Charles could be on the throne until William, who's already 41, is 62, 63, only a little younger, only a little bit younger than how Charles is now. When are we going to get a monarch who's only in their 50s or in their 40s? So it is a question of, especially as, kids, people are having children. William waited a lot longer to have children than his ancestors did. Although Charles waited a long time to have children as well. Compared to his mother, who, was having kids at 21. Elizabeth was 21 when she had Charles. So anyway, but Charles was more like 31 when he had William. And William was about 31 when he had George, who is obviously the next in line to the throne after William. Unfortunately, we don't have any women in the direct line of succession for the next 3 generations. Well, 2 generations now that Queen Elizabeth has passed. Charlotte, George would have to abdicate or unfortunately die for Charlotte to ever become queen. So maybe George will have a girl. But they did get rid of the male priority primogeniture. A woman who is born first can still be in the past that would have skipped her. And so the only reason Elizabeth ever became queen, because if she'd had a younger brother, she wouldn't have, is the fact that not only was she a firstborn, but they only had daughters. So it wasn't like the line was going to pass down to Margaret. But if Margaret and Elizabeth had a younger brother, the line of succession would have gone down to him. That's how backwards patriarchal primogeniture is. They finally got rid of that right before the birth of George. I'm amazed they didn't get rid of that before William and Harry were born. It didn't end up being an issue for them because they were 2 boys. But, if William had been a girl and then Harry had been born, Harry would have been king, not been first in line. It's just crazy to me. Absolutely backwards. No wonder the UK almost never had female monarchs. Even though the female monarchs are some of the longest reigning. Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth together, and then Elizabeth I as well. Very long, successful reigns compared to the men, which are all shit shows for the most part. It's quality over quantity when it comes to female monarchs in the UK. I think is very interesting. Interestingly, we just saw the Queen of Denmark just abdicate after 52 years on the throne. I wonder if she saw that final episode of The Crown season 6 and that gave her some ideas. But speaking of that episode, they do kind of talk about, Jonathan Pryce's Philip, pontificates about how the monarchy is never going to be the same. And it's true. I really do think, with the passing of Queen Elizabeth and her husband, an old way of doing things is dying with the British monarchy. And it's the same with when Queen Mary died. It's the same with when Queen Victoria died. The monarchy is slowly behind the times, but slowly modernizing and changing to keep up, to survive. And that's super important because the monarchy has to understand that clinging to austerity, as a defense against the changing outside modern world, to preserve itself as its only means of survival is not going to ensure its actual survival. If you're not going to reflect the modern world, then people are going to resent you and think of you as a backwards, deeply problematic imperial kind of relic. And that still kind of is what the monarchy is. It's hard not to see, William doing these tours of the Caribbean full of brown and POC people, and this white man, going to England and waving and saying, "Hello, my subjects." I mean, it's really in this day and age. It's so what we will probably see, and I predict this in the next 10 to 15 years. Pretty much all of the Caribbean, for the most part, maybe one or two might stick around. Jamaica is definitely going to become a republic. I think Jamaica is ready to be out. Barbados recently left the imperial family, shall we say. Now, keep in mind, the imperial family is different from the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is not like an actual governing body. The Commonwealth is like an organization. It's sort of like, the United Nations of the UK. That, I think, has some benefits. I think the Commonwealth has a lot of former empires in it, a lot of countries that in Africa that used to be under British rule, for example, that have stayed in the Commonwealth. And I don't know if some of these countries might also leave the Commonwealth when they leave the British royal overseeing. I don't know what the term is. My brain, too much I had to keep track of for this video, but you know what I'm talking about. But it'll be very interesting to see. I mean, yeah, that legally they would not be a part of the Commonwealth. There's the Commonwealth of Nations, and then there's the British Commonwealth. Two different things. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see how many countries. I think Australia is the big one. I think that Australia is starting to really, really start to like, and in the 80s, they show this in Terra Nullius, it got very close. And Diana, of all people, saved the monarchy. Diana made the Australians fall in love with the monarchy again. And I think that's really ironic considering the royal family would have considered pretty much everything Diana did to almost completely destroy the monarchy. But I think they forget that her popularity, also in the 80s helped a lot in these places. But it comes at a price because if you mistreat her, then they're going to be even more upset with you. So Australia and New Zealand, it'll be interesting to see what they do. And then, of course, there's always Canada as well. Canada's dealing with the Quebec issue on its own. And I think that that's a more pressing issue for Canada than the Commonwealth. I think that they've got to sort that out. I would love to see an independent Quebec, by the way. So anyway, I would also love to see Scotland be independent from the UK. But that's, these are complicated things. And I understand that there are pros and cons to a lot of these things. It might not be in the best interest for everyone to make such radical changes. But I do believe there will be another referendum at some point in the UK about Scotland. Not so sure about Wales. I feel like Wales is, its GDP isn't strong enough. Anyway, this is kind of a side trail. I don't know if Wales is so focused on that at this point, but Harry and Meghan. Oh my gosh. I don't want to make this video too long, but I did say that I would talk a little bit about Harry and Meghan, and I would talk about reading Prince Harry's bombshell memoir, Spare, that came out a year ago. So when I read it a year ago, I listened to the audio version. I was like, when I do finally finish, when The Crown finishes, I want to share my thoughts on it with this video. Because even though it's been a year and it's sort of died down, the Harry and Meghan stuff, it is still very much the issue du jour when it comes to the royal family. I think that what has gone down with Harry and Meghan is, and I have watched their special on Netflix. I did watch their, little series where they interview and talk about their experience in the royal family and their subsequent divorce from the royal family. I thought that was very interesting as well. So what I will say is I do feel that the Harry and Meghan situation is one of the most egregiously sad things that in the 21st century, the royal family, to have this happen is honestly inexcusable in my opinion. To have the first ever woman of color marrying into the heart of the royal family for 1,000 years And, Meghan is biracial. I know she's very white passing to a lot of people of color, but to a lot of white people, she is not. And that's where this becomes contentious. I mean, she seems very white passing to me as a white person. And I did some research on Meghan and her background and her upbringing, and that's a whole other thing. But I do want to say that I think on paper and on surface, it is absolutely horrendous how this has all been handled by the royal family, but also just how it all had to go down. I'm sure that the royal family would have loved for this to have never happened, but I think that their sort of point of blame for how it all went down is squarely with Harry and Meghan, and I will never swallow the monarchist pill and act like Harry and Meghan are only to blame for all of this going down. But I believe that at best at worst they are equally to blame. For best for Harry and Meghan, they're not to blame at all. I don't know the full story. This ain't my life. It's not my business to a certain degree. So who am I to really speak on knowing cold, hard truths and facts? But Harry did reveal a lot of stuff in his memoir. And let me say one thing to all those monarchists. I just do not understand what Harry would possibly have to gain from making such horrendous accusations if they were not completely, categorically true. Particularly when it comes to the William assault allegation. For people to think that Harry is making this up, I mean, what kind of delusional conspiracy theory world do you live in? Why would Harry make up a story like that and accuse his brother of something like that if it wasn't true? I mean, I don't know Harry personally, but he seems like a stand-up guy who really does love his family and really hates that they become sundered. Why would you dig yourself in that kind of hole? I mean, to print that, it absolutely happened. I'm sorry for the William and Kate stans. It happened. I do not believe that when it comes to the important stuff, Harry is telling an ounce of untruth. Everything he is saying is true. Could he perhaps be getting in some distant factoid memories of some events potentially in the wrong order that some monarchists are, going, well, he doesn't exactly remember where he was when his, great grandmother died in 2001. I'm like, y'all, we need to get our priorities straight here, okay? The recent events are more important than what happened 20, 25, 30 years ago. And what's recently happened, he is telling the truth on, okay? So, first of all, what he says William did to him is inexcusable. I never felt particularly strongly about William or Harry until any of this happened. I always kind of just felt like they were both very privileged, sheltered men who, at best, I mean, we're probably getting good PR training to not to make sort of gaffes that would make them look problematic in public. I had no idea how much Harry had sort of deprogrammed himself from not only the monarchy's kind of way of thinking about things, but also his own self-admitted kind of privileged white waspy bubble that he lived in. And he's really done the work. He's gone to therapy, finally processing his mother's death. I mean, it's really sad. I mean, what he had to go through at such a young age, but it's really sad that he bottled it up for so long and never went to therapy, never wanted to talk about it until 20 years later. Men really have a different way of dealing with emotions. Toxic masculinity, if you read Spare, toxic masculinity is oozing off the pages when it comes to how he was brought up and all how he was, subscribing to it, as most young straight men would. I mean, I'm not straight, so I never really was after a while, toxic masculinity was I'm out. I'm going to be emotional. I'm not going to worry about fitting into this patriarchal ideal. I don't care anymore. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle. And so I love seeing Harry be this, much more worldly conscious, introspective person who clearly has done the research and the work, not only on himself, but on atrocities and discrimination against people of color and homophobia and sexism. I mean, he seems to really, and I'm not saying that William is the opposite of all of these things, but so far, what we see from William is very staged and theatrical, and I just really wish that William would open us up a little more to who he really is. What we get from William is a very sort of friendly smile and say what you're supposed to say. We don't really get to know much about him, and seeing Harry in such a table side way in these Netflix shows is just, I think, really interesting. I'm always going to support the people in the royal family who are more outspoken and don't like necessarily shut down and belittle their emotions to fit the system. Those kinds of people just really, that's just not how I could operate. It would drive me nuts. It has driven a lot of people in the royal family nuts. And so I don't know. It really just, it really stains my view of William. I really do think that before I go on too long-winded of a rant here, the crux of what I want to say is that you can't take out the racism of the British press, but also potentially the biases of some members of the royal family with the thought of Harry marrying a woman of color, even if it's a biracial one. And you can't take that out of the story. That is still very much a part of it. I think that the royal family is learning the wrong lessons from history, and is scared of its own shadow. And I think that the way they're going about this with the whole kind of silent treatment and kind of blame the other side is really damaging to their brand. It's really damaging to the reputation that is so important and precious right now, particularly with the Queen now being gone. I think a lot of us liked the Queen. We didn't necessarily like the monarchy, the system behind it. And the ironic thing is that Charles, and my mom keeps trying to remind me of this because my generation doesn't know Charles like that. Charles is a reformer. Charles gets it. I mean, if you watch The Crown, they probably make him seem to be even more of a reformer than he really is. But Charles is all about making the monarchy more cost value and cost effective for money, not as big of a drain on the taxpayer, less austere, less pomp, less, outside of the modern world. I mean, Charles is a very modern thinking person. He has openly embraced other religions in the core of the Church of England, which is a big step, something Elizabeth never did. He spent a lot of time in the 80s and 90s advocating for social welfare programs and, really going further with the charity work that royal family members were expected to do than any of his peers. Now, Diana went even further and was more tactile. Diana had the photo ops actually touching AIDS patients, for example. Charles never went that far, but you have to remember that Charles was still going further than any other monarch had in his charities before Diana. So you have to give Charles a little bit of credit here. Charles is not the most austere person. I think obviously now that he's monarch, he has to rein himself in. I wish he wouldn't do that because I feel like, you're in charge. You can do what you want. I know you're worried about the stability of the monarchy, but we kind of don't. We want to see you be your own individual self. We want to see the Charles who is more conscious of fighting for climate change and all of these causes that he really cares about, and not suddenly start to become not just give them lip service at certain occasions and become very austere like most monarchs have in the past. But I'm sure his advisors, the men in the suits, are like, if you do this, the monarchy's over. Can't do that. So they're getting bad advice. Bad advice. But when it comes to William and Kate, I think the fate of the monarchy really rests on William's shoulders. I think that Harry, has done all he can. I think that there is an unfortunately almost irreparable, rift in their relationship. A year on from that memoir, and the two just, are not seeing eye to eye. But I do believe, and if you read the book, Harry's tried on numerous occasions to try and get William to see his side of things, to try and understand why they left the monarchy, why the press was just insufferable, and why it's really sad that the press they were not further defended by the family. I mean, that's the main allegation, is that obviously his main ire in the book is with the press and the tabloids and Rupert Murdoch, who owns a lot of these tabloids, the Sun, the Daily Mail, these horrendous, predatory news organizations that the royal family is beholden to. It's really sad what he illuminates, and others have illuminated it before him. The royal family is so afraid of an uprising that they sort of have this tacit agreement with the British press and tabloids that they get this level of access and control for in exchange for good publicity in certain areas. And that means they get to pick and choose who they get bad press for and who gets better press. And the sort of moral of the story is a retreading of the Diana story. You know, Meghan Markle was starting to get really positive press, and William and Kate didn't like it because it was making them look kind of bad. And so the tides turned. And so someone, maybe not directly, but you know, William and Kate had power here. They could have stopped this and they didn't. Charles could have too, but I don't blame Charles as much. I think Charles is older. He's got his own issues. I feel like this is more William's responsibility, his relationship with his brother. I feel like Charles is almost a lost cause at this point. And believe it or not, I think there is actually still somewhat of a relationship between Charles and Harry. From what I understand, they do still talk on the phone occasionally. Whereas with William, they just act like, I mean, there's just no communication anymore. It's really sad. William probably hates his guts. And Harry probably is just like, well, I hate that it came to this, but I guess I'm going to hate your guts back. I mean, what are we going to do? There's a new royal book about the royal family that comes out and alleges this from from sources. Say the two are moved beyond hatred to an even colder stage, indifference. It's really, really sad. I mean, I think, doing the Duke and Duchess of Windsor treatment to Harry and Meghan in this day and age is just so messed up. Especially since they don't have Nazi. I mean, yeah, Harry did make that snafu in 2005, but come on, they don't have Nazi sympathizer allegations. I mean, this is really messed up. And I think that in the end of the day, the royal family is stronger when the family is openly, honestly communicating with each other, acknowledging potentially mistakes that have been made, and showing a united front, and showing that they do not tolerate the xenophobic, racist, sexist bullshit that these tabloids, owned by Rupert Murdoch predominantly, are allowed to spew about people who marry into the family, particularly a black woman, a black biracial woman. They didn't they decided this wasn't a cause worth taking down the British tabloid press for, and I think that speaks volumes. It speaks volumes about their priorities. It speaks volumes about what they think is acceptable and not acceptable for when it comes to publicity. And it shows bias. And then I think that they're like, oh God, it got out of control. What can we do? The damage had already been done. Harry was like, I got to get out of here. My wife's mental health is in the gutter because of things that she's reading that she can't avoid. She talks about this. So just don't read it. It gets to a point where that's not possible because it forms every single person's opinion of you and every single interaction you have with the public. It becomes untenable if they're printing horrendous things about your baby and your child, and there are death threats. It's really sad. It's just an absolute tragedy what has gone down. And honestly, unless William has this, complete rehabilitation when it comes to this issue, which I don't see happening. I think that he is being told by the bigwigs that, he's playing it the way that he should, which is just, denounce and deflect and go about doing your princely duties. Focus on being your little good British boy that you are, and don't put a foot wrong. Don't show any personality. Don't show any character. Don't show any ounce of regret or remorse over things that may have happened in the past. If that keeps up, I would very much like to see the monarchy abolished. I don't want to see someone like William on the throne. I don't think that he has the emotional intelligence for it. I worry about his temper based on these allegations of assault, and also other sources saying that he is a shouter and very argumentative. And I really do not think he is as open-minded as his father. I think that he is potentially some of the worst parts of the closed-mindedness of his ancestors, but in a toxic male form, rather than a cute, demure old lady form. And so I really worry about William. I think that this rift between Harry and Meghan is only going to damage the monarchy. You can't have Harry and Meghan. It's you got to bring them back into the fold because it's interesting. They've sort of faded out of the limelight now. It's only been a year since the memoir and the series. But I do wonder, we saw this cast of Suits come out on the Golden Globes recently. And I do sort of wonder, Meghan should be there. Like, I feel kind of bad that Meghan feels that she can no longer be a public person at all. Even though, and I had to keep correcting my mom on this, them wanting to escape the UK had nothing to do with necessarily wanting to be entirely out of the limelight. Because Meghan's an actress. She's used to being somewhat under some level of public interest and scrutiny, and Harry's certainly used to it. It was being able to tell their story on their own terms and have some more privacy than they would in the UK, which was just completely out of the question for them there. Because tabloid culture is way worse in the UK than it is in the US. It's bad in the US, but it is extra bad in the UK. There's a real rot at the core of what's the tabloid culture of the UK. And I don't know how that can be fixed. I think it's starting to get addressed. And then after Diana's death, there was some movement as well. But then it went backwards again with the Harry and Meghan situation. People were starting to forget what happened to Diana, which initially caused the paparazzi to become a lot more, regulated and backing off of this kind of hawkish sort of stalking, basically, that drives people insane. But yeah, I don't want to see Meghan feel like she has to be a recluse because she is Scarlet Letter. I'd love to see Harry and Meghan, make waves in Hollywood and do their own thing with their charities and be our own version of the royal family. I hate to say it, but that version over there, there's not a lot of people left that I don't know. I don't like the direction it's heading. And I also think they're in facing tough waters regardless because of all of the republics of all of their constituencies abroad saying, I think it's time to go. So we shall see. I definitely think that, Philip says to Elizabeth in that final scene, it's all going to fall, Rome is going to fall apart, but we won't be there to see it. And they're very right, because the monarchy, whether it survives or not in the future, is going to look very different. And it should look very different to the monarchy they're used to. And this is coming from someone who doesn't fundamentally want to see the monarchy completely be abolished. Personally, I would love to see it sustained. I'd love to see all of that preservation of history and tradition, the rich cultural iconography and lexicon that the monarchy is in touch with through generations and generations. I think it's fascinating. I think that the mystique and aura of it, and there's something kind of to be said about selling someone on a country by having these palaces that people live in, even though it could be scaled down still quite a bit, and less at the expense of the taxpayer, to the point I would argue it shouldn't be spent by the taxpayer at all. But, that's basically abolishing the monarchy. And so I do think that I'm torn on the decision, but I do want to see at the end of the day, a monarchy that is reflecting modern values and is not ostracizing people, and kind of acting a bit like a bully and cowering to right-wing corporate-owned press like Rupert Murdoch's Daily Mail and such. We need a royal family that has a backbone there, and that's not what we're seeing right now. And so I say the institution needs to go. It needs an overhaul. And I wish the best for Little Prince George. I hope that he is a wonderful, upstanding, modern, progressive gentleman. And I hope that William comes around and that William and Harry mend their relationship as brothers, because it is utterly heartbreaking at the end of the day. And I hope that Harry and Meghan don't lose any more sleep over this, because I don't think that, to the level of which this got out of control, I don't think much of any of this is their fault. I think that there's a system, and if you're going to buck the system, you're out. And there's just there's no wiggle room there. And it's a very shrewd, and the Crown does a phenomenal job of illustrating this. So all in all, yeah, I'm really conflicted on the monarchy. I'm not going to lie. And I think Peter Morgan's conflicted on the monarchy because his show gives so many mixed signals about it. On the one hand, you could say it's all this deference, all this research to make it as accurate. And it's a love letter. He spent all this time, researching and following the royal family. And the crown is, it's sympathetic to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is, for the most part, I mean, she does kind of turn into a little bit of an antagonist with the Charles and Camilla and Diana storyline. Also, by the way, you want to talk about the real villains? Lord Mountbatten, Dickie Mountbatten is the real villain in the Charles, Diana, Camilla story. Also the Queen Mother. They don't get enough SHIT, and luckily the show completely exposes that. Dickie Mountbatten, super problematic guy. It's tragic how he died by an IRE bombing, but I don't know. I'm not gonna say those things. I'm not gonna say what I want to say. Anyway, yeah. So those are my thoughts. I could go on and on about this. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on the monarchy today. Did you read Harry's memoir? Watch the Netflix special? Are you a Crown viewer who's kind of grappling with all of these same thoughts? Because again, like I said, I think Peter Morgan interjects a lot of moments into the show where, he really shows how out of touch the monarchy can be and how it needs to constantly evolve with the people. There are multiple instances where that's shown. And I think he does a really good job at being objective in showing the tumultuous kind of time frame of the crown going through these growing pains. For thousands of years, it could operate kind of on autopilot. And the last 100 years have proven with social change in this world, and of course the internet and globalization, that the world is a new place than it was 100 years ago, or especially 200 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, or the Enlightenment, or all these other things that happened. But the crown is trying to trace back to, William the Conqueror, right? It's trying to keep that 1,000-year history intact. There's a balance that needs to be struck about honoring history and jiving with the modern times. And I don't necessarily think the people in charge of the monarchy right now are doing the best job in the PR department on that front. So, yeah, William needs to make some sort of statement acknowledging that he's made mistakes and that they are sad that things have gotten to where they are. And that they would really like to extend, at least personally, privately, show that there's willingness to build bridges. That's all he needs to say. That's all he needs to say. It's the smallest amount of extending an olive branch that the public, we need to see to gain favor again. But I don't know. Monarchists will disagree with me. Oh, the William and Kate stands. I'm sorry, I just don't see it. I don't see it. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know it was a long one, but I just had so much to talk about. It's a juicy topic. I love the show. I really hope that we get, more iterations of The Crown in future years when we cover the modern era. The Harry and Meghan era would be so messy. We'd also have Brexit and Boris Johnson and, oh my God, so much to cover, and Donald Trump. Could you imagine the Crown covering the 2010s? I mean, it would be very interesting to see. I think one day we will, whether it's from Peter Morgan or someone else. It would have to be from Peter Morgan, though. It'd have to be from Peter Morgan. He's not too old. I think Peter Morgan wants to go and do the earliest 20th century. He wants to cover, he wants to cover the world wars and the, early 20th century in the monarchy. He's expressed interest in doing like a prequel series. And that would be really, really interesting because, I mean, I'm so fascinated by that time period in history for everywhere in the world, but particularly with the royal family, because I must admit the show got me hooked on it. So I will always be interested in what's going on to a certain degree, thanks to this show. And I will always be much more knowledgeable about the royal family, thanks to this show. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Please give this a like if you did. Subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you all in my next video. Peace, love, and light. Bye.